should be recording another draft physics video production. Alright. DraftScience on YouTube video presentation. There, enough said. Anyway, so I think we'll do a Ken Wheeler video, some of it on free energy. It's just so silly. And it just illustrates the problem with dissidency and the objectors to anything. They're always, not always, can't always be, but they're just too often worse than the thing they're objecting to. Just replacing nonsense with rubbish. No point in doing that. So, yeah, so it's just all quite depressing. And, you know, there's none of these people, these dissident types, want to get into any real arguments about where their theories or models fail and where other models succeed. But anyway, so it's just it's a very difficult place to play. Anyway, so I thought we'll use this video for listing questions. So if you people have any good questions to ask regular physics, you know, like we'll compile a list of these good questions to have a physicist answer in terms of mainly getting to the point that for most of their theoretical conclusions that they've written in hard stone and wish not to debate or discuss, there's very little evidence supporting the conclusion, and certainly not evidence that is exclusive to their theory. There are different ways to interpret the experiments in terms of what they're really saying. Like, for example, Einstein's bent space-time thing. You know, it could be argued that the only thing demonstrated by evidence is that there's a correlation between clocks breaking and velocity. And that's all they've demonstrated with evidence. And there is no evidence that anything called time actually changes. It's just that the mechanisms that you know, have cycles to them will have those cycles broken by having to do the multitasking chore of actually having to move somewhere. That the dancer can't dance as fast if he has to move in a direction. Simple argument, kind of elemental, kind of fundamental, and kind of one you'd have to pay some attention to as a counter theory. Okay, that this is just something that affects the metabolism of the universe, so to speak, that velocity disrupts the function of material objects. Just a fact. So anyway, I don't know if we need to do drawing. So anyway, so if you have questions, this will be the place to put them. If I see other questions on some other video somewhere, I'll include them. I'll put a comment on this video listing the questions as written so far. Don't mind people editing those and making them better. And there's always going to be a context to the question, in the sense that you know, kind of a follow-up, because you can anticipate some of the answers that'll be mush. And so anyway, but anyway, there's lots of ways to pick at the conventional theory, and most importantly, you know, pick at the fact that they really don't have proof of anything, and they're claiming they've settled some of these subjects, and they're a long way from settled. And there should be some conversation about, well, what if they have that wrong? Like, you know, electrons spinning around the nucleus of atoms. There's no real evidence that that's taken place. And I would argue a magnetic model of the atom makes a hell of a lot more sense. And yet they don't want to talk about magnetism and atoms. They decided that they're going to make the electron and the proton electrical things, and they therefore can't be magnetic things. Ergo, Maxwell's declaration, that is, before the discovery of electrons, Maxwell declared they couldn't possibly be monopoles of magnetism. Doesn't make much sense, right? To take the word of a guy who didn't even know they exist, and he already knows that they somehow can't be the monopoles of magnetism. Come on. It's incredibly thin, weak mushy evidence they have for their conclusions. So anyway, a real problem with dissidents is they're either religious kooks pretending to do science, or they're, conspiracy theory nut jobs who think they're going to find, they think there's been this terrible conspiracy to hide the great secrets from us, that somehow the elites, whatever they are, have conspired to hide the truth, and that Tesla knew how to do everything. He was so brilliant. Didn't even have a house. I mean, the guy lived in a hotel room. Anyway, but he had all the secrets of how the world works, and the universe. And it's just mush and stupid and retarded, and I don't even know what to, there's, and it's all based on this God called ether. The magical ether does it all. When ether's just a word, it's just a word. You have to describe like water is a word, and it's H2O, and you can break it down. Well, break down this ether. What are you talking about when you claim the magical ether? What is this ether? What does it do? How does it perform its task? But they just vaguely take every question, just every unanswered thing, and just say ether done it, ether done it. And it's horrible science. It's so underdeveloped. It's so juvenile a way of describing the function. All right, so I guess we'll get brighten this a little now. I thought it looked pretty cool. Yeah, I like him transposed. I'll leave him there a little bit. Yeah, it takes the edge off. All right, so I'm somewhere in the middle of this dopey thing. He's reading some Jump-Kamenko book or some kind of rubbish, and claiming that Heaviside and Maxwell and DuPont or whoever, had all the truth, and Tesla. And yet he can't really recite any statements that make any sense, that provide any explanation of anything. So I guess I'll start by just pointing out that energy is just something we see. Okay, it's happening, and it has the form of movement. And so these crazies, like Ken Wheeler, is going to assert that like a windmill turning, okay, or say water turning a propeller, somehow this movement of this propeller is not the cause, okay, of the stream of electricity that ends up going to another motor that ends up creating another kind of motion, right? I mean, all you're doing is converting motion into motion someplace else. Then we call that the process energy. And where did the energy come from? Well, it came from this movement. So it's all really just about movement, as I've attempted to point out in other videos, that things move from one position to another position, and then they reflect the world differently now, in the sense that anytime you decrease the distance between two objects, you increase the exposure they'll have to each other's existence. And that's just a fact. And if you do it at a regular interval, you can create a noise that can be interpreted as sound, or something you can receive and interpret, and all of that mush. All right, so so I was thinking about ways of describing it. So you could think of a stick, and you could think of hitting it with a force, a little bit of something, and then it would move the stick, and the stick would move back. And you could say, well, yeah, and then I could hit it with another piece at another little bit, tiny bit of a different time, and then I could hit it with a piece from this side, and I can create wobbles in it, and it would wobble. But the truth is once I start doing this a lot, I start hitting it with a lot of energy from both directions, all that's going to happen is that all of these things are going to have a net effect, because the truth is going to be is that these are going to end up hitting, some of this energy is going to be canceled, because one piece of energy will hit at exactly the same time as another piece of energy, in the inevitable probability of having a bunch of them hit. And so a lot of the energy is just going to get canceled out, and it's not going to be able to move anything. And so you're going to have no evidence of its existence. So it was a real energy, but because it was exactly the opposite energy, something going this way and hitting at the same time, it's not going to be registered as any event. It's not going to have any influence on the stick at all. And so the more you put in, the less you get out, in a sense, because the movement gets narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower. So it's just sort of an irony that the more you put in, the more gets canceled out, and you end up with just a little bit of the net effect, which is what is the real difference in real terms between these two sides. One got hit by 2 extra than the other side. So it doesn't really matter whether you have 1,000 or 1,000,000 things hitting. It just matters about how much imbalance there was in all of it. And that's the only part you're ever going to see. You're only going to see the 1,000 plus 1, or the 1,000,000 plus 1, because it was 1 extra that came this way. And that's all that's going to be seen. So a ton of energy, but none of it in a form that we could call energy, because it's not an imbalance. And so the only thing we're looking for is places where there's imbalance in the system. And then you can take advantage of the imbalance, like the imbalance of the rain getting pushed up into the clouds, and then it falls down. Gravity's creating a nice little imbalance, and we can take advantage of that and run the water down a slope and turn a mechanism. Okay, and then so the key thing is he's saying Ken Willer's going to assert that there's no causal connection. And that's a silly thing to say. There's a huge causal connection between the movement of the blades on the movement of the wind and the turning of the windmill. But the key place where, the part that Maxwell was talking about, for example, is the inductive part, the part where you have movement, of a magnet. You take a magnet and you move it, from one position to another position across a wire. What are you really doing? What's the real event that's taking place? And the fact is that you have to understand that the magnet is radiating something that has an imbalance in it, in the sense that it's pushing something more than just. It's like us reflecting light. Everything is doing that, but what the magnet's doing that's different is that it's taking energy of one form, like say X energy and Y energy, and it's pushing. Okay, you could just say north and south energy, couldn't you? It's taking all of one form, ends up going out this end, the north end, and all the south end, no matter where it hits, ends up coming out the south end. So this end is reflecting all the south energy, all right? And any south energy hits this end, ends up coming out this end. So this ends up being all south end, and this ends up being all north end, and those two ends affect electrons oppositely. So the one end attracts the electrons, the other end repels the electron. And so now you can use that invisible, whatever you want to call it, invisible stuff, and you can sort of understand that it's like us. I mean, we could be hit by light, and if we had a mechanism that could take all the blue light and make it go to our legs and radiate, and then all the red light would radiate out the top of our body, you could just understand that changes us in terms of now we sort of have one of those things called an imbalance. So we're not throwing at something. So if an electron is sitting here, we're not throwing at it, a piece of X energy and then a piece of Y energy. They're doing two opposite things. One's attracting and one's repelling, and so they're equal. So when it's not doing that, when it's just radiating or reflecting just the Y energy, and that's the only kind it's reflecting, you can sort of understand that then all the energy is doing the same thing, and that is pushing the electron in a direction. So anyway, so all the magnet's really doing is pushing electrons, right? Because it's not producing a balanced force. It's only producing one kind of radiation, and the one kind says electron move. So if this was a north end of a magnet and I push it towards some electrons, the electrons are all going to be moved by this push, this force, this a pushing force. So they're going to be able, you're going to be able to transfer movement in a material thing, you know, in matter, big stuff, and you're going to convert that into movement of the little stuff, smaller bits. I mean, through the medium of a force, through the medium of a bunch of smaller bits that are all moving the speed of light that everything has around them. But magnets are doing, again, this specific thing where they're not pulling and pushing. Okay, there is no pulling, by the way, but for the sake of argument, there's a consequence that, you know, well, I'm not going to explain it all, but anyway, it's in the other videos. But anyway, it doesn't really matter. The end effect is attraction and repulsion. If you're doing both at the same time, you can't affect this object. But you know, no matter how close or far you get, you're doing the same thing. You're pulling and pushing at equal amount if you have an equal distribution of the force, which we have, because we're not magnetic. We're not polarized. We're not producing just one force, repulsion. So if I move that one force, reflector, close to electrons, the electrons move, and when the electrons move, they change the polarity of the atom, which means they make it into a little magnet, usually, of some kind, a little bit. And at the same time, it's also moving electrons. That is, it's actually pushing one electron into the electrons next to it, and that pushes the electron next to it because they all have the pushing force between them. And so they're just going to do the same thing this is going to do. Is they're separated from each other by the red force, the north force, the electron force, and that force is between them, and so you push them closer. It's just an incident of pushing, and so electricity is pushing electrons and moving them, and that's all you need to do is move. So you're just changing the wind moving into electrons moving in a wire, and then you can change the electrons moving in a wire back into you know, some bigger piece of matter moving. But the key to the whole thing, again, is to create this imbalance. And you can either create it using a magnet, or you can create it with like an electromagnet, where you're, you know, actually going to spew the force, not just reflect it differently, not just absorb it from the field, but to take it and convert it from electron movement into an actual movement of electrons on the surface of a substance, and cause it to radiate the force, in the sense that you're going to cause that stick to vibrate. And when this thing moves, when you move a piece, the surface of something that's all producing the right force, and you move it in and out, in and out, okay, you're constantly going to push, relax, which the electrons in the wire need you to do. But anyway, that was before you got to the pushing. So anyway, I don't want to go through the whole thing with motors and the fact that you know, it's all just converting one kind of movement, the mechanical movement of an object that is creating a field that is polarized, and taking that polarized field and pushing into objects that are polarized, the electron and proton, and causing them to inversely react to the field you're pushing with and move, and that movement, and just reversing it. So you have them moving, you can transmit their movement a long distance through a wire, and then you're just going to do the process in reverse, and you're going to allow their movement to affect a magnet somewhere else and move it, which will affect, you know, turning a fan and blowing the air back. So clearly there's a coherent, reasonable connection between all these things, and I think the only thing Ken Wheeler's bitching about is that this part, this field that the conventional physics calls the electric field or the magnetic field, you know, those two fields, he wants them to call this ether. And that's what the whole thing is about. These fields are being created by the fact that the magnet does this function of polarizing the field. But there's only one field, I would agree. And if you want to call it ether, fine, but they don't have a description of what the ether is, and they certainly aren't going to understand the ether as being something that's made out of electron force and proton force, which it obviously, I would argue, is well demonstrated to be, because that totally explains why there's an inverse reaction between the two objects. Yeah, probably enough. Probably.
I derided true free energy for many years, but I've always trying to correct myself.
Yeah, well, that's a funny one. So he concedes, oh, I was wrong to insult the free energy people. Now, maybe that's just because he wants their love, and he doesn't want to offend them because they're a gigantic mob. So he'll say something nice to them, but I don't know what fact he found that could possibly change his opinion. That he's not going to list the facts, like what fact he discovered that said to him, yes, now I understand. This experiment demonstrates it. Some experiment somewhere demonstrates that this idea of whatever free energy would be, somehow the field is created without a magnet and without the necessity that you actually move the magnet. Yeah, no, I don't think so. You're not going to move something. See, even if you had a force field around you, like in Star Trek or something, you put up your shields, right? You have your shields up. Well, your shields can't push something except when you first turn them on, right? Then they can push the space around them, little dust and crap in there, right? So when you turn your shields on, okay, then you can move stuff. But once they're on, you can't move anything, right? Unless you move. So now if I move through space, well, now my shields will push stuff away before I get to it, right? Because my shields are going to push it. Because I put a force into the air, the atmosphere, that's capable of not doing push and pull. It can only does push. And so it's going to push the electrons away, for me. But that's the only way to understand it. The reason why the magnet has to move is because, well, once you've initiated the field, it's not moving anymore. So you have to move the field towards the electrons to force the electrons to move, because they just balance to the world that exists. So once you have the shields up, they balance to the existence of your shields, and they're in a position they say is equal, or they're in equilibrium. And now nothing changes until you move the Enterprise. You have to move the spaceship to move your force field to move stuff in the environment. And it's that simple. And he's saying that's somehow complicated. No, that's not complicated. The windmill has to turn, or the force fields around the magnets don't move. And if they don't move, they're not going to push any electrons anywhere.
And I know that I was wrong on that premise. I'm not wrong on magnetism, though.
I was wrong about that, but I wasn't wrong about this. It's just kind of bad logic there, because you're not going to give me a reason to think one was any different than the other. What were you convinced by, Ken? That would be the thing to tell us. What fact, what paragraph, what sentence did you read where you said, gee, yeah, free energy is a real thing?
For certain. But free energy, the absolute definition of free energy, is possible.
Yeah, so says you based on nothing, except a bunch of people want to think so, that somehow you don't have to do any moving of any matter to make fields change or to make electrons move. We can just move electrons by just going move. Point our little hand moving gun at stuff and just go move. There, that was easy.
I'm not going to tell you that I know what the arch form.
The arch form. Why can't he speak English? Why does he have to speak whatever this stuff is, like 200-year-old English? I don't even know if they said crap like that back then. The arch form. So instead of saying I don't know how this manifests or how this functions, but no, instead he's got I don't know what the arch form is.
Of of ether perturbation is for true.
Ether perturbation is. So, again, he's basically saying, look, there's an ether. Okay, let's just say the ether is little balloons or something. All smashed next to each other and they perturbate. I hit one balloon, it makes the other balloons contract and it re-expands, and the next balloon contracts and re-expands. So, okay, so we have perturbation. Again, how do you perturbate something? So he's basically saying, no, you can freely perturbate. You could just, you don't have to do any work at all. You don't have to rub anything or do anything. You don't have to change anything. You don't have to put anything in. You just perturbate.
Power generation, but I know it must exist.
And how do you know that? Again, I would just, I'm asking, okay, fine, you're making an assertion. Angels exist. And you're saying you believe it. Why? Oh, there's no explanation of why you believe it.
Because there is no causal relationship in induced currents from everything we have today, which is for power generation.
So again, Maxwell never said anything like this. Maxwell knew you had to move something else. What Maxwell didn't know is what's between it, what's creating it, what is the force field made out of. That's how Maxwell was thinking of it. There's definitely something coming out of something that allows it to communicate with something further away than it is. The magnet is here, and it's going to start affecting things at a distance. And so, just like Newton, he's just arguing that, well, I don't know what that stuff is, but I know it's something. Okay, something's there. And so he called that the ether. And this nut is trying to say, because Maxwell didn't know how to define that ether, what it is, that he was saying there's no causal relationship. Of course there's a causal relationship. He didn't believe in uncaused events. No evidence of that.
And that is really, really important. Falling water is not being transformed into electricity. Wind is not being transformed.
See, is there any point in saying that kind of stuff when we know it's fundamental and essential? So he's saying we don't need something to turn the magnet. That the magnet can, if we wish hard enough, the magnet can produce a field that keeps moving and keeps pushing. No, it can't.
Video you'll watch, like if you watch videos about wind turbines, the wind is being transformed into electricity. That's what it's occurring. It's
so he says something just so overtly inarticulate at minimum. You have to admit this is so badly stated that there's nothing you can say. So like I said, he's saying that what the wind is doing can be replaced by some other thing. That you don't need to have blowing wind, and you don't need to have falling water. You don't need to have matter moving, okay, to cause perturbations in the ether. That is, to cause the ether to compress and such. When clearly, yeah, you do. And especially in the case of electricity, we know the only way you can get the electricity to keep moving is you have to allow the electricity to relax again, and then push it again, and then relax and push it. You can't really knock the stick. You can't really knock the electron off the atom, so to speak. You have to take advantage of the fact that it'll move and compress, and then it goes back, and then it can move and compress, and that you can do. So alternating current will create you can produce that, but you can't produce direct current, because once you put your force field into the bound electrons, the electrons bound inside the wire, that they're not going to move anymore. Once you've pushed them to the wall, they'll just sit there at the wall, and they'll just wait for you to leave so they can go back to where they were.
Electrical arch form that partakes of aerodynamic blades that induce the movement of the wind to turn the arch form.
So he doesn't even say it right? I mean, he's saying the blades don't produce the wind. He's talking about the other side of the experiment where the wind is you move the fan to push the wind. So he doesn't even say it right, and he's, for the fifth time now, he's using this stupid arch form I mean, why don't you just go back to medieval days and turn everything into medieval language and be really quite obtuse, even more obtuse.
which kicks open the door of the ether for power generation.
So anyway, so there's some sort of door. So the ether, you don't have to. And like I said, everything about the story kind of explains that this really is about tipping, and for electricity, you just can't just push it to one side and say, there, I've done my job. I have perpetual electricity because I tipped it over here. You have to depend on the fact that it needs to relax, and then you push it again, then you relax it and push it again.
But there's no causal relationship there. The math on that is extremely clear. The facts on that are extremely clear, and that, of course, absolutely defines the ether. And what's really important about that is that...
So he didn't provide any of those facts that are clear or any of that, And he reads a couple of sentences out of the book that don't say anything clear. So again, it's just mush. I wish that worked, but it's not working.
True free energy is a 100% undeniable effing absolute, not possibility, but certainty. But
okay, so he says it again, and he feeds us nothing, and he gets greatly rewarded for saying something for which he cites no evidence, no experiments, 5,000 views, 401 thumbs up, which it's a pretty good rating for 5,000 views. For saying absolutely nothing but asserting essentially, I know God exists. God exists. So he's just telling the believers what they want to believe, confirming it, and he's not using anything called reasoning. There's no reasoning to explain why he believes this, why he would assert something like this. We don't need movement to create movement in the field, is essentially what he's saying. Nothing material has to move. The field can be moved by magic. Well, that's irritating. Let's see, we'll try this.
none of us in humanity, including myself, know what that electrical... that will actually be magnetodielectric is what it would be. Magnetodielectric arch form.
Okay, magnetodielectric arch form. And people eat this crap up. Magnetodielectric arch form. And then he claims nobody knows what it is. Well, let's understand Ken Wheeler's history. He's claimed like 2 years ago, he made a video a year and a half ago, promoting that, oh yeah, any day now I'm going to have news about this guy who invented this motor that's going to revolutionize the world, and it runs on no batteries and no energy and blah blah blah. The same bullshit that's out there on the internet. All these guys who promising, tomorrow, yeah, tomorrow, I'll have it tomorrow. Working on it, just almost finished. It's I mean, they're liars soliciting money from dupes and idiots.
Would look like. But it must exist.
So it must exist. They don't know what it looks like. Oh, I guess his Tesla, his God Tesla can't tell him what it looks like. Heaviside can't tell you what it looks like. Maxwell couldn't tell you what. Nobody could even describe what this event would be like. This free energy event, and yet they're sure it's possible. This free energy thing. I can perturbate the ether, no problem. I can make the balloons, compress, just by. Compress. Doesn't work.
But this all actually gives credence to the ether, as if the ether needed credence, because everything is an ether perturbation modality. See, people say
An ether perturbation modality. Again, and what's the ether? Has he ever drawn the ether? No. Give us some idea of what he thinks an ether is. It's coaxial cable. But then it's the anti-ether. Gravity's the anti-ether. He can't even describe the ether, and I'm supposed to understand what an anti-ether is?
well, what's the field? You know, what is ice, water, and steam? Ice, water, and steam are just different temperature and pressure modalities of water, right?
They're different movements. That'd be the key word. They're moving the molecule. The more you move the molecule, then it transforms, in the sense that obviously the molecules end up further apart from each other. So it's the same stuff. Yes, the molecules just end up further apart from each other, and that means it has an effect. But nothing's really changed for the little atoms themselves, except they're not as close to each other anymore because they're got a lot of movement going on. Movement, movement, movement. No free energy there. You got to put energy in to get those little molecules moving.
Aren't they? They're not different things. Gravity is an anti-field. Specifically is mutual mass acceleration. Point non-specific mutual mass acceleration. So,
point non-specific mutual mass acceleration. So it's accelerate. The ether didn't need to perturbate it. It just mutually mass accelerates. So you have atoms, and they just decide, I'm going to accelerate. And if as long as you're accelerating, I'll accelerate. So it's mutual. I don't know. So that's an explanation. I mean, this is worse than religion. I mean, at least religion does describe the demons, and how they manifest, and your person starts crazy talking and all that kind of stuff. And there's description of the angels a little bit, I think, a little bit. I'm not sure if they actually, about halos. That's in the Bible, right?
we've gotten rid of gravity. Gravity is not a field. This is the reason why any scientist...
So again, and the fields are supposed to be what the ether is, right? All he wants regular science to do is call all of their fields ether. So he just wants them to say the ether instead of the magnetic field, or the ether instead of the electric field. But now he's claiming that the ether isn't, okay, because there is no field, so that gravity isn't caused by the ether, because it's the anti-ether, right? Oh God, this is so bad.
When you ask them about gravity, their mind twists and torts. Well, gravity we know is not a force. Well, of course it's not a force. This is not a force. No energy is being exerted when I do this. Well, what is that?
So anyway, so he says no energy is being applied. And I mean, I would obviously say there is a completely understandable disproportion in pressure on one side of the object and the other side. One side is being shielded from the little BBs, because they have to go through the big fat earth to get to you. And the other side, no, all the BBs can get right to you because there's nothing in the way. A clear distinction, and the clear reason why the rock falls is because there's an imbalance in the ether on one side to the other side.
That's a dissipation of the force vectors of magnetic divergence, the after effect.
The divergence of the force vectors of the after effect of the posterior fortification.
Of which is space. But space has no properties, but it does have attributes. So, space.
So that's another one of his famous lines, right? I mean, space has attributes with no properties. I mean, you can't have an attribute without it being a property. You really just can't. You can't possibly attribute, into the world without that becoming one of your properties. It's like having bad breath or something. Your breath leaves your body and goes somewhere and is bad, and that's your property. That becomes something you are, is something that produces bad gas.
I mean, gravity can be eliminated. As far as what electricity is a hybrid of dielectricity and magnetism.
A hybrid of dielectricity and magnetism. So two things he hasn't described. So he's defining something with absolutely nothing. Thank you. Gee, that's so... And again, he gets rewarded for this crap. I mean, this is just such crap. You're just saying, how, God, this is so hopeless. People are so irrational.
Phi times psi equals Q in Planck of electrification. So
pi times psi equals Planck Q of electrification. I mean, I just can't live on this planet anymore. I can't do it. Endeavor to persevere, Gary. Endeavor to persevere. All right, I'll endeavor to persevere. Okay. Oh, God, this is tough.
Eliminated out electricity as a unique field modality. There are only two conjugate geometries in the universe, dielectricity and magnetism. Magnetism is a dielectric field. Specifically, the...
Draw me one. Just something? Just get something? Jesus, is so bad.
These are the geometries of force and motion, inertia and acceleration, centrifugal divergence and centripetal convergence. Respectively, the geometries of the...
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. How can he get away with that? How can any honest, decent, reasonable human sit there and say, oh, I totally understand. Totally. Fuck.
Toroid, relative to magnetism, and the geometries of centripetal convergence, or the geometry towards counter space. Not the geometry of counter space itself, which has no physical geometry, but the geometry towards. That's the distinction with the difference. The geometry towards counter space, of course, the hyperbola.
Amazing. So this and this are somehow making things move somewhere and stuff.
The hourglass shape. But everything is reducible to the ether. I'm not into conspiracies. Not to say that certain conspiracies, of course, do exist.
Like which ones? Yeah, the ones with two people in the conspiracy. Please. But whatever.
But there's one thing I'm absolutely certain of. A true conspiracy that this world was promulgated via countless people, specifically the relativists. Not that they're conspiring in a secret room or something, but has wholly been conspired against is the ether, because the ether is the explanation for...
Oh, the ether's been conspired against. And again, they've already, like I said, Einstein was already quoted as basically calling his bent space an ether, and he's still complaining.
Free energy is the explanation against the fact that the four Maxwellian field equations that all scientists use today are not causal relationships for electromagnetic induction. They're absolutely not.
So again, they're clearly causal. They're clearly describing event over here and consequence over here. So there's no doubt about that. What the equations don't tell you is what's the force carrier, the virtual photon. That's why they call it a virtual photon, is because physics is trying to tell you what it is. Well, it's a field. It's a field of virtual photons. But they don't have any explanation for how a virtual photon communicating back and forth between objects could possibly say, come to me. How something pushing into something could tell it to move towards it. So they can't figure out how it does that because, they haven't worked on a model that does that because they think everything's waves and perturbations and ethers. Because they believe this nonsense is the very reason why they can't get it correct. It's because they lost focus to the quantization of energy, to the idea that there's just two basic kinds of things in the universe. There's the stuff moving the speed of light, and then that matter stuff that isn't. And the stuff moving the speed of light interacts with the matter stuff, and vice versa. But they don't interact with each other. Matter doesn't really hit matter. It hits the field, it hits the shields around the matter. So every piece of matter's shielded from other pieces of matter, essentially. In the sense, the real bits, the electrons and the protons are charge, and they really won't just bang into each other.
Northern equations indicate an existence of a causal link between electrical and magnetic fields. Thus, therefore, we must conclude the electromagnetic field is a dual entity having electrical magnetic components simultaneously.
Oh, fuck.
Businesses don't power the American economy.
So he's actually reading something.
Created by their common source, time.
He couldn't even bother putting his ads in places where he's not reading out of the book. It's amazing. Oh, God. Fucking chowderhead.
variable electrical charges and currents. Of course, time is not an entity itself. Time can't act upon anything. Well, sure it can. It makes us age and get older and whatnot, but no.
Yes, time doesn't act on anything. It's a silly concept again. Time is just the fact that the speed of light isn't instantaneous speed. If the speed of light was instantaneous speed, then there wouldn't be any time. Fuck.
Time is only the measure of magnitudes. Time is a measure, it's not a thing. And space has no properties, only has attributes. Only does the idiot is absolutely not possible. And I've known...
It jumped or something. Again, this is... It doesn't have properties, it has attributes. I mean, it's just such a nonsensical statement. You might as well say it's a ghost then, right? Ghosts have attributes. They go boo, and stuff. But they don't exist, right? So, yeah. Oh, God, it really is just such a frickin' religion.
And that for many, many years. But here's the math to prove it. And by the way, if you don't like math and equations, you're not going to like these books because they're really, really heavy with it. But actually, there's a really good one in here.
So he insults the mathematicians. He insults the fact that conventional science has a bunch of mathematicians telling it what the truth is, and then he just sits there and points out, "Well, I got better math." It basically implies that math is useless, and then he sits there and shoves it in your face and says, "No, I got the math."
Okay, as we see, Maxwell, too, considered electromagnetic induction as a phenomena in which a current, or electromotive force, is induced in a circuit, but not as a phenomena in which a changing magnetic field causes an electrical field. He clearly said that the induced electromotive force is measured by, not caused by, the changing magnetic field. Just as Faraday, he made no allusions to any causal link between magnetic and electrical fields. That is really...
So, whatever. Not true, right? I mean, clearly Maxwell is basically tying the two they're not two separate fields, so it's just silly. But obviously there was an inverse, he had to create the inverse relationship. That's why they bisected the speed of light, blah, 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 blah. And so, yes, one field's creating the other field because they're trying to figure out some way to make the yin-yang work. But, it's just kind of silly to say that because Maxwell... so this is somebody else saying what Maxwell said. So that wasn't quoting Maxwell, that was quoting this Debunking guy.
Really profound, and ultimately all that does is spells out the ether. All power generation on this earth is not a causal relationship. It is a
So there's no point in having words and vocabulary, right? Because people just refuse to use them in any kind of rational way. So he's saying there's no causal relationship between the water moving and the turbine spinning and the electricity moving through the wire and turning a motor and causing water to be pumped into a tank. There's no causal link between those events when clearly there's a causal link, and the only thing that is where the physics comes into it is understanding how you convert matter by material objects into motion inside a wire. And that mechanism, they just don't understand shields. They just don't understand the idea that the shields are what's pushing, and you have to have the right kind of shield to push different things. You want to push an electron, you have to have a certain kind of field. You want to push a proton, you have to have a certain kind of field. Oops, wrong one again.
Of course, my phone rings in the back room back there. One of the horrible things about being on YouTube is that, the emails and the phone calls kind of never stop, but that's okay. Ironically enough, the phone call occurred right at the end of this video. The point being is that the ether is irreducible. It cannot be eliminated.
It's irreducible. It's magical. It just perpetuates. It's blah, 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 God.
There's no causal relationship in electromotive force induction. The induction is not a causal relationship, not by the definition of James Clerk Maxwell.
All right, so again, just lying about Maxwell, essentially. I mean, clearly Maxwell believed that you perpetuate an ether. You push the ether. And that's what's transmitting the inductive mechanism, is pushing the ether. So he just didn't know what it was either. He didn't know how to explain attraction and repulsion. Because he didn't have a mechanism for attraction and repulsion. So he couldn't just say, well, you're just pushing on the ether. Because how does one kind of push create attraction in one case and repulsion in the other? And again, Maxwell didn't know what an electron was. Didn't know a proton. Didn't know an atom. Didn't know any of that shit.
Oliver Heaviside or Tesla or any of the rest of them. That's not an opinion or a
Well, it's not an opinion. Moses was the God. Moses was everybody. And then Jesus was really cool. And David guy was really cool. And John the Baptist guy, oh yeah, he was a brilliant one. Oh, they were all so brilliant. It's just a fucking religion.
belief or a conviction. It's a fact. There's not a causal relationship defined in the Maxwellian field equations, nor did Faraday spell out one, nor did Tesla. Specifically, too, by the way. I remember if it was...
Nor did any of them. They are terrible. Right, they've totally screwed up energy in the universe. They have no clue, and so they have no mechanism between action here and reaction over here. Anything that moves at a distance, any action at a distance, they've totally fucked it up because they have no understanding of that stuff moving the speed of light. The light is a force, and it's just like gravity except it's at a frequency, and that's the only distinction. And magnetism is the same stuff. It's just like light, it's just like gravity, except it's been segregated to be all the electron pushing force comes out one end and the proton pushing force comes out the other end. And that's it. It's that simple. And yet they'll keep spouting all this ludicrous jargon. Ugh. These horrible, unexplained, just vague, nasty crap about their gods.
Steinmetz or Tesla, I think they both said this when they talk about power generation. They were talking, there's the exact words they used, churning up the ether. Let me stick that in quotes, okay? Remember that one. That's what Tesla...
Right, and you're claiming they don't need to turn it up. They don't need to move something to swirl the ether. It'll do it all on its own. Free. Get all swirly for free.
But that's an accurate description. Power generation was. And not that this was being transformed into this for power generation. No! Tesla and Maxwell, Charles Perry Steinmetz, whoever made that quote, and they both used it. Maxwell, I know Tesla used it, and I know Steinmetz used it. Accurate description. Churning up the...
So, again, the idea that Tesla believed in free energy is a little bit stupid, just because he was paying a gigantic electric bill. I mean, gigantic. So I think he knew that you have to put energy in to get energy out. He was just arguing that you can distribute it for free, that you can distribute energy losslessly. All right, but I don't think Tesla thought I can make energy for free also. So they don't even know their own gods.
Ether, premises set up by which, using magnetodielectric arch forms for ether perturbation, or what they called churning up the ether. Not a causal relationship like where you stick, it's cause A, stick hamburger in the sausage grain.
Yeah, that's what cause and effect means. That's what the word cause means, is that there's a connection between the event and the next event and the next event and the next event. And, again, when they won't even respect vocabulary, when they just pretend words don't mean anything, it's just, how do you argue with that?
And then meat in the sausage grinder, and then hamburger comes out the other side. This is the cause, and this is the effect. That's not the case in power generation. But every person on...
Of course it is the case, and none of those people, those smart people, believed otherwise, and this tub of crap is just putting words in their mouth. He's just humiliating poor dead people who can't defend themselves. He's attempting to make dead people who can't defend themselves sound like idiots. It's a very bad thing to do.
This ignorant earth thinks that is exactly what's going on. And basically every video you watch says the same damn thing. The wind is being transformed into power. No, it's not. Like air is not being sucked into the wind turbine and magically transformed.
Yeah, there's nothing magical. That's the whole point. That's exactly right. But there's a clear causal relationship. There's no point in saying it doesn't happen that way. And if you want to say it's mitigated through the process of converting the matter's motion into the motion of some ether, and then that ether transfers it to another piece of matter, conventional physics won't argue with you. Nobody will argue with that simple, straightforward description of the reality. Now, again, this whole fucking idiotic objection of his is based on the fact that they call their fields the electric field and the magnetic field instead of calling them ether. If they called it ether, he'd be perfectly satisfied. This is just such bullshit. And again, but they wouldn't be satisfied with some notion that the ether can just, hey, ether, give me some free perturbation. Don't move anything except you move. Yeah, you perturbate, but don't have anything cause you to perturbate. Yes, just give me the free love. Yeah, then they'll disagree with you because that's irrational. There's just no evidence the ether perturbates all on its own. Alright, anyway, so till the next time and such. Just hate this planet. This is worse than the Planet of the Apes. The apes were more rational. The movie version, anyway.